Hello and welcome to Emotion Coaching Part 2. Please feel free to stop or pause or take a break whenever you need to, and you can dip in and out of these resources as you need them. So in session 2, we're going to be covering how do we emotion coach and the 4 steps involved in that. Then we're going to be looking at becoming aware of emotions, our own and the emotions in others. And then we're going to look at some emotion coaching conversation starters. So here we have the 4 steps of emotion coaching. And as you can see there, it says that it's a high empathy style and a high guidance style. So that means we have discipline in the form of boundaries and consequences that are really important. But it's sandwiched between attuning with our children and repairing those relationships when things inevitably go wrong. So it's also really important here to be aware of our own emotions. They talk about putting on your own oxygen mask first before putting it on the young person when on a plane. So you need to be able to be taking care of yourself before you can take care of others. And that's a really important point that we'll come back to a little bit later. So within emotion coaching, children learn about their emotions, particularly the strong ones that are difficult to manage. All feelings are validated, but not all behaviours are valued, and that's really important. So emotion coaching supports the child to manage these big emotions they might be experiencing in that moment. It recognises that all emotions are acceptable, however, not all behaviours are. So it helps children to understand the difference between different emotions they experience, why they might happen, and how to handle these emotions. So these first 2 steps that you can see here, step 1 with empathy, connection before connection, and step 2, labeling validation, naming the emotion to tame it. These first 2 steps help the child to calm their stress response and reconnect with the people around them. Step 3, setting limits. So in this step, you're trying to show there are different ways to behave, and maybe some of them are a bit more acceptable. And then you've got step 4, support with problem solving. And this is about developing different behaviours to give them more tools and maybe more appropriate ways for life, how to behave, how to act in certain situations. This is really empowering for the child to help problem solve and handle their emotions themselves. Okay, so step 1 of emotion coaching is about empathy. So really being in somebody else's shoes, understanding how they're feeling at the moment and why they might be feeling like that. So we start off by observing and listening, watching for changes with our children, thinking about their facial expression, body language, posture and tone of voice. And as parents and carers, we know our children best, and we know when they're upset or they're angry or something's difficult for them. So it's about tuning into that, thinking about the clues that they give us. Sometimes it's really obvious, sometimes it's a bit more subtle. So it's really important that children can feel understood, and then we can start to co-regulate, to bring ourselves aligned emotionally, and then calm ourselves with our children. So we're tuning into our child's feelings and thinking about how does our child express different emotions. But the most important step before that is tuning in to our own emotions. So we're thinking about, how am I feeling at the moment? How am I reacting? And if we understand how we're feeling and how we're reacting, we can be ready to emotion coach our children. So it's important that the adult sets the emotional tone. And it's really good to be able to help start to explore how the children are feeling with them. And we can start off by saying things like, I can see that you get angry when that happens. I'd feel angry if that happened to me, and it's normal to feel like that. We could say something like, I can see that you're frowning and you're kicking the wall and expressing lots of energy and anger. I'd feel like that too, but if I didn't want to do something. So we're connecting with the child, before we're moving on to the next steps. We're trying to understand how they're feeling and perhaps why they're feeling like that. And this is really important, this connection, before we move on to the next steps. And it's really important too that we know how we're feeling and how we're reacting in that moment. So we can do a bit of a check of our own emotions, a check of our own bodies, how we're feeling within ourselves. And that's really going to help us attune to our children. So now we're on step 2, which is about labelling and validation. So like it says here on the slide, it's about listening carefully to what our children have got to say about how they're feeling. Also a bit about what they're doing as well, watching carefully. And it's about respecting the child's feelings so that there's no right or wrong with the way we feel, and letting children know that too. And then what's really important about this stage as well is labelling the emotions, so which we talked about in previous slides, name it to tame it. So by modelling that emotional language, we're building children's emotional vocabulary. And if children can name how they're feeling, they're much better equipped to be able to manage their own emotions, to be able to regulate themselves. So how can we start to do this? So we're validating the feelings and labelling them. So when perhaps a child is really upset about in a party, for example, perhaps you can see they're a bit nervous or worried, you could say something like, I noticed you looking around at the other children. I think you might be feeling nervous right now. Have I got that right? So you've noticed the child is nervous, you've kept them in mind, you've sort of guessed about how they're feeling, and importantly, you've checked in with them. Is that right? So you could say things like that, or you could say, I'm wondering if you're feeling really nervous right now, or I can see that you're really angry. So you're validating that emotion and you're recognizing it within your child. So naming the emotions that a child may be feeling instead of telling the child how they're feeling. So step 3 is about setting limits. So by now we would have connected with our children and we would have validated their emotions. So they would have felt heard and understood. But now we've got to tackle those behaviours that aren't acceptable or perhaps are dangerous. So we're stating the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. We're making it clear that that behaviour is not okay, but how you feel, that is okay. And I understand that. We're separating the behaviour from the emotion and from the child. So how do we go about doing that? So we can think about redirecting those challenging behaviours into what they do rather than how they feel. So we can think about what we say in that. We could say, this is not a safe place to be angry, perhaps. Let's go to a safe place and then we can talk. Or perhaps either hold my hand or your sister's hand. Which do you want to do? So we're sort of depersonalizing that negative interaction by talking about the problem. We're separating the problem, what's going on with the behaviour, from the child after we've attuned and validated their emotions. So now we're on step 4, the final step, and this is all about problem solving. So this can take place either quite quickly after an event has happened, or you might need to give it a bit of time for the child to have calmed down and be in the right place to be receptive to problem solving. And this is really dependent on the situation, and you're going to know your children the best, and you're going to know when would be the best time to approach this. You want to do it within time that they remember the incident or what's gone on, so they can relate that to the conversation. But I think you've got to gauge when's the right time to do this. Straight after somebody's had a really emotional event where it's been really difficult for you all, probably not the best time and probably not really going to be too helpful. So you're going to wait for the right time. That's key with this. So you want to explore solutions to the problem together. So you want to scaffold, that's thinking about different ideas or actions that could lead to a better outcome next time. But it's also important, it's really empowering for children because they know that they can manage this, I can do this myself. And next time they might do it themselves or need less support from you. So things like you can say for this maybe, next time you're feeling like this, what can you do? How do you think you'll react next time if this happens again? So it's about getting the child to think about the situation and talk about it together and come up with different ways of managing that situation. And it's reinforcing that language around emotion at the same time too. So when you felt nervous when you were at the party, what can you do next time that's going to help you feel less nervous? What worked? What didn't work? And then maybe when it happens again in future, you can think about, well, we're going to a party. What happened last time? Maybe you could try this. And then afterwards you can discuss it again. So it's an ongoing process, and these steps can be used all the time. And it's a really good way of helping empower our children and help them become more and more independent in managing their emotions and difficult situations. So here we can see all the steps of emotion coaching, and perhaps we can have a think about it now using an example that's really common. So perhaps you're at the park and your child becomes really angry with another child because they've stolen their go on the swing, for example. So the first thing to do is be aware of your own emotions. How's that making you feel? Perhaps you feel embarrassed about your child being really angry. Perhaps you feel judged by other parents and carers. Perhaps you feel angry towards your child for making you feel embarrassed. If you're aware of your own emotions, you're going to be more aware of how you're going to act and how you're going to handle this situation. So then you can think about connecting with your child. You can think about empathizing with their situation. And if you've taken the time to think about your emotions, perhaps you've taken the time to reflect on how they might be feeling. So you might think, I can understand why they're angry if their go was stolen on the swing. So you can talk to the child about that, and you can say, gosh, it looks like you're really angry because that little girl took your go. So you've named it. Perhaps you can check in with it if that's right. You can say, have I got that right? Perhaps they said, yeah, I am really angry, or words to that effect. Then you can think about, you don't really want this situation to escalate. So you're thinking about setting limits. Then you could say, so it looks like you're really angry about that little girl taking the go on your swing. Is that right? And they've said yes. Well, maybe you need to come with me and come and sit down and calm down for a moment. So you can redirect that, because it's not right to stamp your feet or shout at the other child or whatever else is going on. Might not be the place to start with problem solving. So maybe a little bit later on, perhaps on the way home, on the walk home, you can say, so next time that might happen, somebody takes your go on the swing, what could you do differently? What's going to make you less upset? What's going to solve that situation? You can talk through what they might do. That might be come and talk to an adult, or whatever else might come up, the child might come up with. But you can think about how they could act differently within that situation. It's important to say that doing emotion coaching, doesn't always come naturally. We often revert back to how we've dealt with situations in the past. But if we can think about the steps and give it a go, it's not going to work perfectly every time, but it's about practicing. And it is difficult to remember, and it doesn't always work out how we want to. But I think slowly, if we're doing this the majority of the time, it doesn't have to be every single interaction, children are going to start to be able to label their emotions and are going to be able to start to manage some of these situations themselves with less and less adult interaction. And it's going to help foster that resilience, and it's going to help build that emotional resilience too. And it's going to help them be able to manage these difficult situations themselves. A little bit more about becoming aware of emotion and attunement. So their attunement is being aware of and responsive to another. So being aware of other people's emotions, how they're feeling, and understanding it and responding to that. But I think to take a step back from that, which we've talked about before, it's about understanding our own emotions too. It's really difficult to deal with other people's, particularly highly stressful events or high emotions, if we're in that same state too. But if we recognise how we're feeling and acknowledge it and forgive ourselves for feeling like that and understand that all these emotions are normal and that everybody feels this way at some points, and we forgive ourselves for it, we can be there to attune to our children and help support them with their emotions too. So here we've got some examples of conversation starters. Because like we said before, it's really difficult to get started with this strategy and nobody gets it right every time. But starting off with some of these examples and thinking about what you might say in different situations and then giving it a go is really the best way to approach this strategy. So here there's things like, I can see that you feel angry when that happens. I'd feel angry if that happened to me, and it's normal to feel like that. I can see you're frowning and you're kicking the wall and you're expressing a lot of energy. I'd be feeling like that too if I didn't want to do something. I noticed you looking around at other children at the party. I think you might be feeling nervous right now about joining in. Have I got that right? So all these are starting to use all those steps that we talked about. They're making that connection. Perhaps we haven't here established those boundaries, but that can come a bit later. It's about the initial phase of connecting and empathizing with the child. And that is probably the most difficult part, especially when we're in those stressful situations or times when we think, actually, I just need them to stop at the moment. We can still build in the emotion coaching strategies within that, because that's going to help in the long run our children to manage these difficult situations themselves. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And I think the most important thing is to practice and give it a go, and to know that it's not always going to work out in those 4 steps, and it's not going to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be right every time. But I think if we're doing this quite often with our children, it's going to help build that emotional language, it's going to help build that emotional resilience, and it's going to help them problem solve for themselves as well. And that's going to set them up for success in later life too. So I think the best thing to do is give it a go. And I also think if you're going to do this, it's good to do it with support, whether that's from friends or family or other professionals, and to ask advice from professionals or friends or family and teachers too. Thanks again for listening.